You're listening to the Escapart podcast. My name is Stuart Barrell. Thank you for listening. For those of you who are new to the Escapart channel, we broadcast on YouTube with a set image video. We're also available on Buzzsprout, and we can be listened on a variety of different formats and downloaded via www.escapart.co.uk. Once again, thank you for listening. This week's podcast is an ensemble. A lot has happened over the last few weeks in terms of my physical training for world records and also for other information I've been researching for Harry Houdini. So next week there'll be an update on sort of why Houdini's name isn't trademarked, because recently we did a podcast where we examined how Houdini has become an adjective as well as a noun. But for today, we're focusing on another area that is often overlooked, and that is the areas of science that Harry Houdini did use, as well as the areas of pseudoscience that he didn't. And let's be clear on that. He absolutely didn't use the areas of pseudoscience that people attribute to him. He also blatantly used these areas of science, and it's a shame that some people outside the craft overlook this, because if nothing else, it would have made my science lessons a lot cooler if we could have talked about how to break out of handcuffs. First of all, let's look at this logically. Metallurgy. Harry and his compatriots would have had to have had a knowledge of metals and how those metals can be worked, their tensile strength, their crystalline structures. He would needed to have known that. And you may turn around and go, why? Why would he needed to have known metals? Well, first of all, if you think about it, if you're being restrained and you know the metal you're being restrained in has a low tensile strength or is no good at certain shear points, you have additional skills and additional abilities you can bring to break out of that restraint, especially if it's a challenge, especially if it's a sudden challenge. Whereas if you know what you're being restrained with has no shear points, you know not to try and waste your strength, waste your energy, waste your time trying to break out of it using certain methods. You have to focus on different areas. So having a knowledge of that area of science, having a knowledge of what the metal can do, how the metal can work, what its weakness is, reinforces your skill as an escape artist. The next area that Houdini would have used, and is recorded to having been using, and even attributed, was Newtonian physics. It was, of course, the conservation of momentum. Now, people say, really? Well, how did he do that? Where he would hit an object to knock it open. In fact, there are recorded examples of where other people were using the same principles to explain how other escape artists were breaking out of devices, even if this wasn't the case. There's anecdotal reports and even a write-up where a person would, one of the reporters who challenged Houdini for the mirror cuff escape, used that method to demonstrate how ineffective a modern police handcuff was. And as a result, you have to understand physics to understand where to position an object and what to strike it against. So again, this is an example of science being used to demonstrate, to explain, to assist with an escape. The next thing he would have used, which again is a science, is mechanical advantage. Again, mechanical advantage, leverage as we call it. Now, I know this may seem like common sense, but if you sat back and explain how you can use mechanical advantage to overcome a locking device, you can use mechanical advantage to overcome the restraining nature of a device you're locked into, then immediately you can understand that you have to understand where the fulcrum point is. You have to understand where the pivot point is. You have to understand the tensile strength of the pick you're using or the device you're using in order to overcome the resistance of the mechanisms. And if you can explain that in such a way as to make it, this is important because, and explain the science of why it works, it explains exactly how Houdini performed a lot of his escapes. You're not giving away the secret, you're simply explaining that by use of physics such as fulcrum points, mechanical advantage, and turning small movements into large movements, or large movements into very, very, very powerful small ones, you were able to manipulate the device in such a way as to take it beyond its design, or to mimic the key or other elements that were required to allow you to escape. One of the other areas that Houdini used, of course, was psychology. And it wasn't just the psychology of manipulating the audience, it was also the psychology of knowing how to present himself, how to position himself, how to work with an audience to make them emotionally engaged. Because on its own, a person sitting on a chair tied in rope isn't that interesting because there's not a lot else happening. But when you introduce the psychology of it, when you introduce all the conversations, all the information given by the performer, be it Harry, be it a modern escape artist, if it's done well, if the psychological science of explaining why you're doing it is explained and presented perfectly, then you can perform an amazing theatrical escape and people will buy into it. Some performances, and no names, and I may be speaking about myself, so please don't get on your high horse and say who are you to criticise. Believe me, sometimes if you don't get the psychology right, no matter what you do, it's going to look rubbish. So again, psychology was important. So far we've had mechanical advantage, we've had conservation of momentum, we've had metallurgy, and we've had psychology. What other science did Harry engage in his escapes? Well, there is one more, and it is the science of hypertrophy. I can barely pronounce it, but it's hypertrophy, and it's muscle building. Now, Harry had a very lean figure because of his swimming, but he always maintained he had to train, he had to remain fit in order to perform his escapes. And that is true, because he needed the stamina to perform on stage, to do the shows that he did, to keep the schedule that he did, but also he needed the physical strength to perform. He wasn't a muscle builder, he was never going to be the size of an Alexander Zass or an Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he was a very lean and toned performer. And you don't get that without an understanding of the science of muscle building and muscle training and stamina training. You may not have understood that you were using a science, but you actually were. And this leads us on to the scientific tropes he used. So we have 5 different areas of science that he was engaged in. There were 1 or 2 pseudosciences, let's call them, that people attributed to him. The most famous was that from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which was the fact that Houdini was in fact dematerializing. He would be restrained, go behind the screen, and then he would somehow teleport or convert himself into a gas or some other form of element, or ether, or something that had yet to be defined by science, and then transfer himself to another part of the stage. So for ease of explanation, he would teleport from where he was to where he needed to be, thus freeing himself. Nonsense. But because of the person who said it, the man who created Sherlock Holmes, you do find yourself saying, is it in fact true? No, it isn't. You can't teleport yourself. In the same way as Houdini wasn't using telekinesis. He wasn't using the ability to manipulate objects with his mind. Now, before we get into a semantic argument, I am not saying that Houdini was not using his mind to manipulate objects. He was, by sending nerve impulses down nerve fibers to muscles that moved, allowing him to manipulate the object. I am simply saying that he did not use his mind without touching an object to manipulate it. And before anyone else writes in and says, well, maybe he did, I do not include delegating the job to Jim Collins as a form of telekinetic ability. That's delegation, that's management. So, he didn't teleport, he didn't have the ability of Professor X from the X-Men to manipulate things with his mind. Equally, he didn't hypnotise the entire audience into believing he'd done the escape when in fact he hadn't. He didn't psychically wipe their mind or manipulate them into thinking they were watching a great performance. So that leaves us with 5 sciences that we can show that Harry Houdini and other escape artists use, and 3 supernatural abilities that at the moment we can show that Harry and some performers do not use. So thank you for listening to the Escapart podcast. I've been Stuart Bowl. You've been absolutely wonderful as ever. And if you'd like to subscribe, please click on subscribe on the YouTube link. If you are listening on Buzzsprout, please continue to listen. Thank you. You guys have been absolutely wonderful. Take care, keep safe, and stay well.